Try something right now. Open your mouth, but don't make a sound. Feel your tongue, your lips, your throat. All that biological machinery sitting there, waiting. Now think about this. For most of human existence, that machinery existed, but language, as we know, it didn't. Our ancestors had mouths and brains and things to say. Here is something that should shift how you think about communication. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for about 300,000 years. But complex language, the kind with grammar and syntax and abstract concepts, may have developed only 50 to 100,000 years ago. That means humans communicated without language for longer than they've communicated with it. For 200,000 years or more, our ancestors lived, loved, hunted, raised children, formed societies, and somehow coordinated complex activities, all without the words we take for granted. They had something. But what was it? How did they make themselves understood? If you are settling in for sleep tonight, this is the kind of mystery that touches something deep. Before there were words for love, there was love. Before there were words for fear, there was fear. Our ancestors experienced the full range of human emotion without being able to name any of it. Subscribe and stick around. To understand pre-linguistic communication, we need to understand what language actually is and what it isn't. Language isn't just making sounds. Birds make sounds. Whales make sounds. Even bacteria communicate chemically. Language is something more specific and more powerful. Language has grammar. Rules for combining words into sentences that convey meaning beyond the individual words. Language has displacement, the ability to talk about things that aren't present, things that happened in the past or might happen in the future. Language has productivity, the ability to create infinite new sentences from finite elements. No animal communication system has all these features. Bees can communicate the location of flowers, but they can't discuss yesterday's flowers or tomorrow's weather. Chimps can learn sign language symbols, but they don't naturally combine them into complex sentences. Human language is unique, but language didn't appear suddenly. It evolved gradually from simpler communication systems our pre-linguistic ancestors used. Understanding those systems helps us understand both where language came from and what human communication was like before words. Let me tell you about the communication systems our ancestors definitely had. Because some human communication is so ancient that it predates our species entirely. Facial expressions are universal across all human cultures, and many are shared with other primates. The smile, the frown, the look of surprise, the expression of disgust. These aren't learned, they're innate. Blind people who have never seen a face make the same expressions as sighted people. Charles Darwin recognized this in 1872. He argued that emotional expressions were evolved, not cultural. A smile means the same thing in Tokyo, Lagos, and New York, because our common ancestors smiled the same way hundreds of thousands of years ago. Our ancestors could read each other's emotions instantly, without words. Joy, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust, all communicated through the face. In a world without language, Your face was your primary communication device. Body language is equally ancient. The submissive crouch, the dominant stance, the aggressive posture. Primates have used these for millions of years. Our ancestors knew who was in charge, who was threatening, who was friendly, all from posture and movement. Touch was crucial. Grooming, running fingers through another's hair, picking out parasites, was probably the primary social bonding activity. It releases oxytocin, reduces stress, builds trust. Our ancestors spent hours each day touching each other, maintaining social bonds without words. Eye contact communicated intent. A direct stare could be challenge or threat. Averted eyes signaled submission. Prolonged mutual gaze built connection. Even today, we communicate enormous amounts through our eyes. Attraction, hostility, interest, boredom, often without realizing it. And then there were vocalizations. Not language, but sounds. Grunts, cries, laughter, screams. These are controlled by older brain regions than language and emerge spontaneously without learning. A baby's cry, a laugh of surprise. These aren't words, but they communicate powerfully. Let me tell you about what scientists have learned by studying modern apes. Because our closest living relatives give us a window into what pre-linguistic communication might have been like. Let me tell you more about what we've learned from studying primates. Because the communication systems of our closest relatives reveal what our ancestors probably started with, and how far they developed before language emerged. Chimpanzees have a repertoire of about 60 to 70 distinct vocalizations, each with a specific meaning. The food grunt announces a discovered food source. The alarm call warns of predators. The scream signals distress. The pant hoot identifies individuals across distances. But chimp calls are mostly involuntary. They can't suppress them, can't fake them, can't produce them arbitrarily. A chimp who finds food will grunt whether it wants to or not. The calls are tied to emotional states, not to deliberate communication. This is a crucial distinction. Human language is voluntary. You can choose to speak or stay silent. You can lie, you can discuss things that don't make you emotional. This voluntary control over vocalization was a major evolutionary leap. Chimps also use gestures, about 66 distinct ones that researchers have catalogued. Hand begging for food, arm raise requesting grooming, foot stomp demanding attention. These gestures are more flexible than calls. Chimps seem to use them more deliberately. Remarkably, recent research has shown that different chimpanzee populations have different gesture repertoires, something like regional dialects. This suggests gestures can be culturally transmitted, learned from others, rather than purely innate. A hint of cultural variation in communication. Bonobos, our other closest relatives, are even more communicative through gesture and expression. They use facial expressions more subtly than chimps. They vocalize during sex and play in ways chimps don't. Their communication seems more nuanced, more context-sensitive. Some researchers believe gesture, not vocalization, was the foundation for human language. Gestures can be produced voluntarily. They can refer to specific objects. They can be combined in sequences. Early human communication may have been primarily gestural, with vocalizations added later. Our ancestors probably had richer repertoires than modern chimps. Larger brains, more complex social lives, more diverse environments, all would have favored more elaborate communication. But the basic elements would have been similar: expressions, gestures, touches, and emotional vocalizations. Let me tell you about what daily life might have been like for our pre-linguistic ancestors. Because imagining their communication in context helps us understand what it could and couldn't do. Imagine waking at dawn in a group of perhaps 30 individuals. You know everyone, you've grown up with them, slept near them, groomed them, fought with them. You know their personalities, their relationships, their status in the group hierarchy. Communication begins immediately. Yawns and stretches, glances exchanged. A mother pulls her infant close. Two males eye each other warily. There was tension yesterday. A young female approaches an older one, presenting herself for grooming. All of this communicates. None of it requires words. The group needs to decide where to forage today. Without language? How? Perhaps a dominant individual simply starts walking in a direction and others follow. Or don't. Perhaps there are gestures indicating direction. Perhaps certain calls have become associated with certain locations. As the group travels, eyes and ears are alert for danger. A sudden freeze by one individual alerts. Everyone, a specific cry means predator. Maybe different cries for different predators. Eagles require looking up. Leopards require climbing trees. Snakes require jumping back. The communication is urgent and effective. Someone finds a fruiting tree. The food grunt brings others. There is competition. Who gets the best spots? Status determines access. Dominant individuals claim the prime locations. Subordinates wait or forage at the edges, all negotiated through posture, gesture, and occasional conflict. A mother teaches her child which foods are safe. She doesn't explain, she can't. She demonstrates she eats certain things and avoids others. The child watches, imitates, learns. Knowledge passes through observation, not instruction. In the evening, the group gathers. Grooming sessions strengthen bonds. Infants play while adults rest. Perhaps there is a fire, though we're not sure when fire was controlled. The closeness is palpable. These are your people. You communicate through 1,000 small signals, none of them words. Let me paint a fuller picture of this evening scene, because it reveals so much about how our ancestors connected without language. The grooming would have been extensive. In modern chimp groups, individuals spend about 20% of their waking hours grooming. For early humans, with more complex social relationships to maintain, it might have been even more. Hours of fingers running through hair, picking at skin, building bonds. Grooming wasn't just hygiene. It was therapy. The gentle touch releases endorphins. The close attention signals care. The reciprocity builds trust. In a world without words for "I care about you," grooming said it clearly. Perhaps there was music. Of a sort, rhythmic vocalizations, humming, drumming on logs or bodies. We don't know when music emerged, but the capacity for rhythm and vocalization predates language. The evening might have included sounds that weren't words but weren't quite singing either. Sexual communication would have been important. indicating interest, negotiating consent, building pair bonds, all without words, through proximity, through touch, through display, the intimate communication of bodies, understood without explanation. Conflict would have flared and been resolved. A stolen piece of food, an unwanted sexual advance, a challenge to status, resolved through threat displays, submission gestures, reconciliation touch, the drama of social life played out without dialogue, and then sleep. The group arranging itself according to relationship, mothers with infants, pairs together, allies near each other. The arrangement itself communicated. Where you slept showed who you were connected to. This was life for hundreds of thousands of years. Complex enough to survive, to raise children, to maintain social structures, but limited in ways we might not appreciate. Some things couldn't be communicated. Some coordination was impossible. Some knowledge couldn't be passed on. Let me tell you about those limitations. Because understanding what pre-linguistic communication couldn't do helps us appreciate what language made possible. You couldn't talk about the past or future. Without words for yesterday or tomorrow, how do you discuss what happened last week or plan for next month? You might remember, but you can't share the memory. You might anticipate, but you can't coordinate the anticipation. You couldn't discuss abstractions, justice, truth, loyalty, betrayal. These concepts may have existed in some form, but they couldn't be articulated, debated, refined. You might feel that something was unfair, but you couldn't explain why or argue about it. You couldn't teach efficiently. Every skill had to be demonstrated, watched, and imitated. No verbal instructions, no explanations of why something works, no correction of subtle errors. Teaching was slow, limited to what could be shown. You couldn't coordinate complex plans. A hunt requiring multiple people in specific positions at specific times. How do you organize it without words? Perhaps through practice, through repetition, through implicit understanding. But the complexity was limited. You couldn't resolve disputes through discussion. Conflicts had to be settled through dominance, through physical contest, through avoidance. No negotiation, no mediation, no appeal to principles. Power determined outcomes more directly than it does with language. And crucially, you couldn't accumulate knowledge across generations efficiently. Each generation had to relearn what the previous generation knew through slow demonstration and observation. Innovation was possible, but couldn't be explained, only shown. Let me tell you more about this limitation, because it explains so much about human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans made the same stone tools, used the same techniques, lived the same basic way. Why? Not because they were stupid. Their brains were as large as ours. They lacked the means to improve efficiently. Without language, you can't discuss why a tool works. You can't debate improvements. You can't explain a new technique to someone who didn't watch you develop it. Innovation was possible, but it couldn't accumulate. Imagine inventing a better way to chip stone, a technique that makes sharper, more durable blades. How do you teach it? You can demonstrate. But without words, you can't explain the principle. Your student learns to mimic your movements but doesn't understand why they work. When your student teaches their student, details are lost, the technique degrades. Within a few generations, your improvement has disappeared, averaged back into the standard approach. Without language to preserve and transmit understanding, innovations couldn't build on each other. This explains something puzzling about human evolution. For most of our existence, technology barely changed. The same stone tools, the same hunting techniques, the same way of life for hundreds of thousands of years. Then suddenly, everything accelerated. The acceleration coincides roughly with the development of language. Once humans could explain ideas, debate improvements, and pass detailed knowledge across generations, innovation compounded. Language didn't just let us communicate, it let us accumulate. Once language emerged, everything changed. A good idea could be explained, debated, refined. Knowledge could be stored in stories and passed down generations. Each generation didn't have to start from scratch. They could build on what came before. This is cumulative culture, the ability to improve on what previous generations achieved. It is what makes humans different from all other animals. Chimps have culture. Each group has its own traditions. But chimp culture doesn't accumulate. Our culture does, but only with language. Consider what became possible. You could tell someone about a place they'd never seen. You could describe a technique without demonstrating it. You could warn about dangers you'd encountered long ago. You could discuss what might happen if certain choices were made. You could argue, that is crucial. Before language, disputes were settled through dominance, not discussion. With language, you could make a case, present evidence, appeal to principles. Persuasion became possible. Consensus could be built. You could plan. Complex plans require discussing them. Who does what when? What happens if something goes wrong? What the goals are and how we'll know we've achieved them. Without language, planning was limited to what could be shown and remembered. And you could tell stories. This may be the most important thing language enabled. Stories encode knowledge, preserve history, transmit values, and bind communities together. Every culture has stories. Before language, there were none. Let me tell you about what we know of how language evolved, the physical and cognitive changes that made human speech possible. The human vocal tract is uniquely shaped for speech. Our larynx sits lower in the throat than in other primates, creating a longer pharynx that can produce a wider range of sounds. This comes with a cost. We're the only mammals that can choke on food, but the benefit is greater vocal flexibility. Our tongues are more mobile than other primates, able to shape sounds with precision. Our lips can form tight seals for certain consonants. Our breathing is under more voluntary control, allowing the fine modulation of airflow that speech requires. A tiny bone called the hyoid, which supports the tongue, is shaped differently in humans than in other apes. We found hyoid bones from Neanderthals that are human-like, suggesting they too may have had some speech capacity. The bones from earlier ancestors are more ape-like, but the changes weren't just physical. Language requires specific brain structures. Broca's area in the frontal lobe is involved in speech production. Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe is involved in language comprehension. Damage to either causes specific language deficits. These areas exist in other primates, but they're smaller and less specialized. The expansion and specialization of language regions in the human brain happened gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, enabling increasingly complex communication. A gene called FOXP2 is particularly important for language. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe speech and language disorders in humans. The human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acids. But those differences appeared around 200,000 years ago. Interestingly, Neanderthals had the human version of FOXP2. This suggests they may have had language capacity similar to ours. Whether they actually used complex language, we don't know, but their brains and genes were equipped for it. The question of Neanderthal language is one of the great mysteries of human evolution. They had brains as large as ours. They made sophisticated tools. They buried their dead, which suggests symbolic thought. They cared for injured and elderly individuals, which suggests complex social bonds. Did they speak? We'll probably never know for certain. Their vocal tracts may have been slightly different from ours, but if they had language, it might have been as sophisticated as early human language. If they didn't, it shows that big brains and culture don't necessarily require words. The earliest modern humans, Homo sapiens, appearing around 300,000 years ago, may not have had full language either. The physical capacity was there, but language is also cultural. It has to be developed, passed on, refined over generations. Some researchers place the emergence of full language much later, around 50 to 70,000 years ago, coinciding with the great leap forward in technology and art. Suddenly, humans were making complex tools, creating art, spreading across the globe. Language might have enabled this explosion. Others argue that language emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, with the Great Leap Forward representing a tipping point when language became sophisticated enough to enable rapid cultural change. The debate continues. What we can say is that for most of human existence, communication was something between animal communication and modern language. More sophisticated than chimps, less sophisticated than us. Enough for survival, not enough for civilization. Let me tell you about the theories of how language might have emerged. The scenarios scientists have proposed for this momentous transition. Some researchers believe language evolved gradually from primate calls. Our ancestors' vocalizations became more varied, more voluntary, more combined with gesture over time. Sounds became associated with specific meanings. Eventually, grammar emerged to organize these proto-words. Others believe language emerged more suddenly, a genetic mutation that rewired the brain for recursive thought, the ability to embed one idea inside another. This recursive capacity, they argue, is what makes human language fundamentally different from animal communication. The gestural theory proposes that language began with hand movements, not sounds. Our ancestors communicated through increasingly complex gestures, which were eventually accompanied by vocalizations. The vocalizations gradually took over because hands needed to be free for tool use. Some researchers emphasize the social function of language. As human groups grew larger, Grooming couldn't maintain all the necessary social bonds. There wasn't enough time. Language evolved as grooming at a distance, a way to maintain relationships without physical contact. Robin Dunbar proposed that language evolved for gossip, sharing information about who did what to whom. Gossip lets you track relationships and reputations in large groups without witnessing everything yourself. It is social intelligence amplified. Whatever the origin, language probably didn't emerge all at once. There would have been intermediate stages, proto-language with words, but no grammar, or grammar with limited vocabulary. The transition from pre-linguistic to linguistic communication was likely gradual. Linguists have tried to imagine what proto-language might have looked like. Perhaps individual words existed, names for things, actions, individuals, but no way to combine them grammatically. Water and danger and baby, but no way to say danger to the baby near the water. This proto-language would have been enormously useful compared to no language at all. You could label things, draw attention to specific objects, reference individuals, but you couldn't tell stories, explain plans, or discuss hypotheticals. Grammar. The rules for combining words was the key innovation that made language infinitely powerful. With grammar, a finite vocabulary becomes infinite expression. You can describe anything, including things that don't exist. You can talk about the past, the future, the imaginary. How did grammar emerge? Perhaps through regularization of word combinations. Early humans might have strung words together in various orders, but over time, certain orders became conventional. Children, learning from their elders, would have regularized these conventions further. Each generation probably improved on what they received. Children are remarkable language learners. They pick up grammar rules that aren't explicitly taught. They regularize irregular forms. They expand vocabulary. The language system improved with each generation. Let me tell you about what life might have been like during this transition. When some humans had more language than others, when communication was changing within living memory. Imagine being part of a generation where language is emerging. Your parents communicate the old way, gestures, expressions, emotional calls. But you and your age, mates are developing something new. New sounds with consistent meanings, new ways of combining them. Children might have been the drivers of this change. Children are better at learning language than adults. Their brains are primed for it. Each generation of children might have regularized and expanded what they heard from their parents, gradually building more complex systems. There would have been misunderstandings, new words that meant different things to different people, grammatical rules not yet established. The frustration of wanting to communicate something complex and lacking the tools, but also the excitement of new possibilities. The groups that developed language would have had advantages. Better coordination in hunting, more efficient teaching, more complex planning over time. They would have outcompeted groups without language. This created selection pressure for language ability. But the transition wasn't just about practical benefits. Language enabled new forms of thought. Once you have words for concepts, you can manipulate those concepts mentally. You can think in ways that weren't possible before. Language shaped minds as much as minds shaped language. Let me tell you about what remains from prelinguistic communication. Because we haven't lost those ancient systems, they still operate alongside language, often more powerfully than words. Consider how much you communicate without words every day. The smile that says you are friendly, the frown that signals displeasure, the posture that projects confidence or uncertainty, the tone of voice that conveys emotion regardless of the words. These are ancient systems, still active. Research suggests that in face-to-face communication, words convey only about 7% of emotional meaning. Tone of voice conveys about 38%. Body language conveys about 55%. Our prelinguistic heritage dominates emotional communication. When words and body language conflict, we usually believe the body language. If someone says they're fine while their face shows distress, we know they're not fine. Our ancient systems for reading emotion override our newer language processing. Laughter is prelinguistic. You don't learn to laugh, you are born with the capacity. Laughter occurs in all human cultures and in other great apes. It is a social signal, an invitation to play, a release of tension. It communicates powerfully without meaning anything specific. Crying is prelinguistic too. A baby's cry communicates urgency and distress without words. Adult crying still communicates grief, joy, frustration, in ways that words can't quite capture. We cry when words fail us, reverting to older systems. Music may be a vestige of prelinguistic communication. It communicates emotion directly, without semantic content. A sad melody makes you sad, without saying anything about sadness. Some researchers believe music and language share evolutionary origins. Let me tell you more about music, because it may be the closest thing we have to a prelinguistic communication system that is still richly used. Music communicates emotion directly. A minor key conveys sadness. A major key conveys happiness. And this seems to be universal across cultures. Fast tempo excites, slow tempo calms. These associations aren't learned. They're built into how our brains process sound. Lullabies exist in every human culture, and they share certain features: slow tempo, simple melodies, repetitive patterns. Mothers have been singing babies to sleep for hundreds of thousands of years, using musical communication that predates language. Rhythm is especially powerful when we hear a beat. Our bodies want to move. This entrainment, synchronizing our movements to rhythm, may have been crucial for coordinating group activities long before language. Working together, moving together, bonding together. Group singing and dancing create intense feelings of connection, what psychologists call collective effervescence. This shared emotional experience, coordinated through music, binds groups together. Our ancestors probably experienced this long before they had words for it. Even our use of language is shaped by prelinguistic patterns. We don't just choose words, we choose tones, rhythms, emphases. Poetry relies on sound patterns as much as meaning. Rhetoric uses vocal techniques that bypass rational analysis. The ancient systems infuse the new. Let me tell you about what studying prelinguistic communication reveals about human nature. Because understanding our communicative origins helps us understand ourselves. We're fundamentally social creatures. Our elaborate communication systems, pre-linguistic and linguistic alike, evolved because we need each other. Solitary animals don't need to communicate much. We've invested enormous evolutionary resources in connection. We're deeply emotional creatures. Our pre-linguistic systems are primarily emotional, expressing and reading feelings, not conveying information, even language. That rational tool is saturated with emotional content. We're feeling beings who learn to think, not thinking beings who learn to feel. We're embodied creatures. Communication isn't just mental. It is physical, faces, hands, bodies, voices, all engaged in expressing and perceiving. The modern fantasy of pure information transfer ignores our physicality. We communicate with our whole selves. We're contextual creatures. Pre-linguistic communication depends heavily on context. Who is communicating? What is the situation? What is the relationship? Language can be more context independent, but we still rely heavily on context to interpret meaning. And we're ancient creatures. Our communication systems have been evolving for millions of years. The sophisticated language we prize is a recent addition to an ancient toolkit. When language fails or isn't available, the older systems are still there, still working. There is a kind of wisdom in this. When we face something truly profound, birth, death, love, loss, we often find words inadequate. We reach for touch, for presence, for the older systems. Words can describe the experience later, but in the moment, they feel beside the point. Therapy has recognized this. Body-based therapies work with posture, movement, and physical sensation to process trauma that is stored below the verbal level. Sometimes healing requires communication that bypasses language entirely. Meditation traditions have recognized it too. Sitting in silence, focusing on breath and body, can produce insights that words seem to contaminate. The goal is often to quiet the verbal mind and access something deeper, something older. Even in conversation, the most meaningful moments often happen in the pauses. The look exchanged between old friends, the hand on a shoulder during grief, the silence that says more than any words could. We know this instinctively. Let me tell you about what all this means for understanding ourselves today. Because the pre-linguistic past shapes the linguistic present in ways we often don't recognize. We trust faces more than words. When meeting someone new, we form impressions in milliseconds based on facial features, trustworthiness, competence, likability. These judgments are often wrong, but we make them automatically using ancient systems that evolved before language. We're moved by music and moved to tears by stories, not because of information content, but because they activate emotional systems that predate language. Art works on pre-linguistic levels. The most powerful communications often aren't about the words. We struggle to express our deepest feelings in words because those feelings evolved before words existed. Love, grief, joy, terror. We have words for them, but the words feel inadequate. The feelings are older than language and don't map onto it perfectly. We communicate better in person than through text, because text lacks the channels our ancestors relied on. No tone of voice, no facial expression, no body language. Emojis are an attempt to add some of that back, but they're a pale substitute. We bond through shared physical activities, eating together, dancing, sports, because these echo the communal activities through which our ancestors bonded. Words can supplement these bonds, but rarely replace them. Consider how much of modern life involves pre-linguistic bonding. Sports teams that become like families through shared physical activity. Concerts where thousands feel connected through shared musical experience. Dinners where the food and company matter more than the conversation. Children communicate pre-linguistically before they learn to speak. And this communication is effective. A baby who can't say a word can make their needs known through cries, gestures, and expressions. Parents learn to read these signals, creating communication that predates language. People with severe language impairments can still communicate meaningfully. Individuals with certain types of aphasia lose the ability to form sentences but retain emotional expression. They can convey love, frustration, fear, the fundamentals, through older channels. Even across language barriers, humans manage to communicate. Travelers in foreign countries where they don't speak the language can still get food, find shelter, make friends, through gesture, expression, and basic human signals that transcend specific languages. This suggests something important. Language is layered on top of more fundamental communication systems, not a replacement for them. Take away language, and communication continues. It is limited, but it is not nothing. The foundation remains. Let me share some thoughts about what pre-linguistic communication teaches us about the nature of understanding itself. Understanding predates language. Animals understand each other. Their intentions, their emotional states, their likely actions, without words. Our ancestors understood each other for hundreds of thousands of years before language. Language enhanced understanding. It didn't create it. This suggests that language isn't the essence of thought. We can think without words, in images, in spatial relationships, in emotional patterns. Language provides tools for certain kinds of thinking, but thinking itself is broader and older. When we communicate, we're doing more than exchanging information. We're coordinating attention, establishing relationships, expressing emotions, affirming social bonds. These functions existed before language and continue alongside it. Consider a mother comforting a crying child. She doesn't give a lecture on why there is nothing to be scared of. She holds, she rocks, she makes soothing sounds. The communication is physical, emotional, pre-linguistic, and it works. The child calms not through understanding words, but through understanding safety. Consider two people falling in love. The words they say are almost beside the point. What matters is the gaze, the touch, the tone, the proximity. They could speak different languages and still fall in love. The communication that matters is older than any language. Consider the bond between humans and dogs. Dogs don't understand our words. Maybe a few commands, but not language. Yet we communicate deeply with them. We read their emotions, they read ours. The communication is entirely pre-linguistic, and it is entirely real. This tells us something important. Communication isn't fundamentally about words. It is about connection, coordination, understanding. Words are one tool for achieving these goals. A powerful tool, but not the only one. The pre-linguistic systems are tools too. The deepest communication often transcends words. A parent holding a frightened child. Two old friends sitting in comfortable silence. A crowd moved to tears by music. In these moments, we touch something older than language, something more fundamental. Think about this as you drift toward sleep. For 200,000 years, humans like you experienced everything you experience. Love, fear, curiosity, wonder without having words for any of it. The experiences were real. The communication was real. The understanding was real. Your pre-linguistic ancestors held their children and felt love. They lost friends and felt grief. They watched sunsets and felt wonder. They didn't name these experiences, but they had them. The feelings came first. The words came later. You carry those ancestors' communication systems in your body. The expressions that cross your face, the postures you assume, the tones in your voice, the gestures of your hands, all of it connects you to humans who lived before language existed. Tonight, as you lie in darkness, you don't need words. Your body relaxes. Your breathing slows. Your face softens. These are signals too, signals to yourself, signals that would be understood by any human who ever lived. The silence of sleep is older than language. For millions of years, our ancestors drifted into unconsciousness, without internal monologue, without verbal thought, without the words we use to narrate our experience. Sleep is pre-linguistic and still is. There is something liberating in this. All day, you've been using language, talking, thinking in words, processing verbal information. It is exhausting, even if you don't notice. Sleep offers relief from the constant verbal chatter. The mind quiets, the older systems take over. Dreams often feature pre-linguistic communication. In dreams, you understand things without them being said. Meanings are conveyed directly. The logic of dreams is emotional, imagistic, pre-verbal. It is closer to how our ancestors experienced the world. In that silence, you return to something ancient. The busy chatter of language quiets. The older systems remain. Emotion, sensation, connection to the body. Sleep strips away the verbal and leaves the fundamental. Your body remembers how to do this. Every night for your entire life, you've set aside language and entered a wordless state. Every night, you've communicated with yourself through muscle tension released, through breathing slowed, through the thousand signals of sleep approaching. Your ancestors communicated for 200,000 years without the words you use today. They made themselves understood. They coordinated, they bonded, they taught, they loved. They did it all through faces and bodies and sounds and touches. And you do the same, more than you realize. The words are important, but they're the surface, beneath them. Older systems, flow systems you share with every human who ever lived. Systems that connected us before we had names for connection. Language was a magnificent invention, perhaps the most important in human history. It enabled culture, technology, civilization. It let us share ideas across time and space. It gave us philosophy and science and literature. Think about what language made possible. Written language, which came much later, extended language's reach even further. Now ideas could travel across space and time without the speaker being present. The accumulated wisdom of previous generations became accessible. Science became possible. Science requires communicating observations precisely, formulating hypotheses, debating evidence, building on others' work. None of this could happen without language. The scientific method is essentially a protocol for language use. Philosophy became possible. Questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, the basis of morality, these require language to even formulate. Pre-linguistic humans may have experienced wonder, but they couldn't articulate the questions that wonder raises. Law became possible. Organizing society beyond the small group requires rules that can be stated, debated, agreed upon, and enforced language. Enabled larger and more complex societies than had ever existed before. But it wasn't the beginning. Communication came first. Understanding came first. Connection came first. Language built on something that was already there, something ancient and powerful and still active in every human interaction. As you settle into sleep, let the words go. Let the older systems take over. Your body knows how to communicate sleep. The slowing breath, the softening muscles, the quieting mind. These signals need no translation. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight, thinking about the long silence before words and the communications that filled it. There are more mysteries to explore on this channel. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, the most important things were communicated long before anyone had words for them. They still are. They always will be.